On June 30th, 1941, the United States Navy signed a contract with a small aircraft company on Long Island, New York. The contract was simple. Build us a fighter that can destroy the Japanese Zero. The company was Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. Their factory was in Bethpage, New York. At that moment, Grumman had 6,500 workers and a factory the size of a few warehouses. What happened over the next 30 months was not supposed to be possible. From a single factory, one building on Long Island, Grumman produced 12,275 fighter aircraft. At peak production in 1944, they were completing one Hellcat every single hour, around the clock, 24 hours a day. The factory floor never went dark. The machines never stopped. Those aircraft flew 66,530 combat sorties in the Pacific. They destroyed 5,163 Japanese aircraft. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, 19 Japanese aircraft went down. One factory, one plane, one of the most dominant weapons ever manufactured in the history of aerial warfare. This is the story of how they built it. But to understand what Grumman built, you first have to understand what America was losing. In 1941 and into 1942, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero was untouchable in the Pacific. American pilots flying the Wildcat knew it. The Zero was faster in level flight. It climbed faster. It turned tighter, and its pilots had years of combat experience from the war in China. The Wildcat had one advantage. It was built stronger. It could take more damage and survive. But surviving a fight with a Zero was not the same as winning one. The Navy needed a new fighter, not an improved Wildcat. Something completely different. Something built specifically to hunt and kill the Zero. The answer came from an unexpected place. In June 1942, a Japanese Zero crash landed on Akutan Island, in Alaska, nearly intact. American forces recovered it, repaired it, and flew it. For the first time, they could study exactly how it performed, where it was strong, and more importantly, where it was dangerously weak. What they found changed everything. The Zero had no armor protecting the pilot. None. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing lining. One burst of 50 caliber rounds into the wing and it burned. The Japanese had traded every protection system for speed and agility. The Zero was a weapon built to kill. It was never built to survive being hit. Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, took that information and made a decision that defined the entire Hellcat program. He would build the exact opposite. Not the fastest fighter in the sky, not the most agile. The one that could take the fight to the Zero on its own terms, absorb punishment, outclimb it, and hit hard enough to end the engagement in seconds. The Hellcat would be built twice as strong as Navy specifications required. Schwendler's personal philosophy: if the Navy asks for it to survive it once, build it to survive it twice. That philosophy is why 12,275 of them exist, and why the Zero does not. In 1941, the Grumman factory at Bethpage, Long Island was a modest operation. 6,500 workers, a handful of buildings on what had recently been farmland. Then the Navy contract arrived. And Grumman did something that has never been repeated in American aviation history. They began building the aircraft before the factory that would produce them was finished. Plant number 3 at Bethpage was still under construction. Walls going up, roof sections being bolted into place, while the first Hellcat components were already being assembled on the floor inside. Workers built the plane in the morning and construction crews built the building around them in the afternoon. There was no time to wait. Between 1941 and 1943, Grumman expanded its workforce at a rate of 1,000 new workers every single month. By September 1943, the factory employed 25,500 people. The floor space of the entire Bethpage operation grew by a factor of 25, eventually covering 2.65 million square feet of production space. To put that number in perspective, That is the equivalent of 46 American football fields under one operation. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. No weekends off, no holidays. The lights inside plant number 3 never went dark for the duration of the war. Workers called it the Iron Works, and the Iron Works had one rule above all others. Every aircraft that left Bethpage had to meet Grumman's own internal quality standard, which sat well above what the Navy required. Leroy Grumman himself is documented saying he would rather slow production than let a substandard aircraft reach a carrier deck. That standard had a direct consequence in the Pacific. Hellcat pilots trusted their aircraft completely. In a dogfight at 20,000 feet over open ocean, that trust was the difference between pressing the attack and breaking off. But the factory and the philosophy meant nothing without the engineering decisions that went into the aircraft itself. Because what Grumman put inside the Hellcat, the specific choices their engineers made about the engine, the airframe, the armament, and the wing, is what turned a production contract into the most lethal carrier fighter ever built. The Hellcat looked simple. That was deliberate. Grumman's engineers made a conscious decision early in the design process. Every system on the aircraft had to be easy to maintain on a carrier deck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean by a mechanic working in the dark with the ship moving underneath him. That constraint shaped everything. The engine choice came first. Grumman selected the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial producing 2,000 horsepower. It was the most powerful and most reliable engine available to American aircraft designers at that point in the war. Air-cooled was the critical word. Unlike liquid-cooled engines, the Double Wasp had no coolant system to maintain, no coolant lines to rupture, and no coolant to lose in combat. A mechanic on a carrier deck could access every cylinder from the outside. Diagnosis was fast. Repairs were fast. Turnaround between combat missions was fast. That engine sat inside an airframe that Grumman deliberately overbuilt. The wing was wider and thicker than aerodynamic efficiency strictly required. Schwendler wanted the structural strength. The landing gear was mounted further apart than any comparable fighter, specifically engineered for the violent controlled crash that every carrier landing actually is. Where other fighters cracked and bent under repeated carrier operations, the Hellcat absorbed them. The cockpit sat high on the fuselage, not for aesthetics, because Navy pilot Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare had personally told Grumman engineers during design consultations that visibility was the single most important factor in aerial combat. You cannot shoot what you cannot see. The elevated cockpit gave Hellcat pilots a commanding view over the nose and to both sides that the Zero could not match. Then there was the armor. The pilot seat had armor plate behind it, armor plate in front of it, bullet-resistant glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with a rubber compound that expanded and closed punctures automatically when hit. Set the Hellcat's wing on fire and the tank sealed itself. The Zero had none of these systems, not one. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, each gun loaded with 400 rounds, total ammunition capacity of 2,400 rounds. Fired together, they produced a weight of fire that tore Japanese aircraft apart in seconds. Every single one of these decisions came from one source. The engineers listened to the pilots, and the pilots had been fighting and dying in the Pacific long enough to know exactly what they needed. On August 31, 1943, the Hellcat went to war for the first time. Fighter Squadron 5 launched from USS Yorktown against Japanese positions at Marcus Island. It was a raid, not a major battle. But the pilots came back with a verdict that spread through every carrier air group in the Pacific within weeks. The Zero could not keep up. The Hellcat could outclimb it. It could outdive it. And at altitudes above 14,000 feet, it was faster in level flight. The one thing the Zero still did better was turn inside the Hellcat at low speed. Grumman's engineers knew that would be the case. That is why they trained Hellcat pilots on one specific tactic from the beginning: never turn with a zero. Use the speed, use the climb, hit fast and break away. The Hellcat was not built to dance with the zero. It was built to execute it. The tactic worked with brutal consistency. By June 1944, the United States Navy had enough Hellcats in the Pacific to bring the full weight of the ironworks to bear in a single battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. June 19th and 20th, 1944. Japan launched the largest carrier airstrike of the entire Pacific War. Over 370 Japanese aircraft launched in coordinated waves against the American fleet. The Japanese commanders believed their pilots and their aircraft were ready. They called the operation decisive. What followed was so one-sided that American pilots gave it a different name entirely: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Hellcat pilots destroyed over 350 Japanese aircraft. The entire operation, the largest air battle in Pacific history, cost the United States Navy 23 Hellcats lost in aerial combat, 350 Japanese aircraft, 23 Hellcats. Japan's carrier air arm, the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, never recovered from those 2 days. The pilots were gone. The aircraft were gone. The experience and training that had taken years to build was gone. The Hellcat had not just won a battle. It had removed Japan's ability to contest the air over the Pacific for the remainder of the war. In 66,530 total combat sorties, Hellcat pilots recorded 5,163 confirmed aerial victories. They accounted for 75% of every aircraft the United States Navy shot down in the entire Pacific War. All of it came from one factory on Long Island that had been farmland 4 years earlier. In 30 months, Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats. Not 30 years, not 30 decades, 30 months, 2.5 years, from a single factory on Long Island that was still being constructed while the first aircraft were being assembled inside it. At peak production in 1944, the Iron Works was completing one Hellcat every single hour, around the clock, every day. The number is so precise it has its own entry in aviation history: 644 aircraft in a single month. A production record that has never been equaled by any fighter manufacturer before or since. Think about what that means in human terms. 25,500 workers showing up every day to a factory that never closed. 3 shifts, machinists, riveters, electricians, engineers, a significant number of them women, entering industrial manufacturing for the first time in American history and matching every production target the Navy set. Each one of those 12,275 aircraft was then loaded onto a carrier, launched from a moving deck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and flown into combat by a pilot who trusted the machine underneath him completely. That trust was not accidental. It was engineered into every rivet, every armor plate, every self-sealing fuel tank, every inch of that wide, stable wing. Rear Admiral John McCain said it plainly in 1942. The name Grumman on a plane had the same meaning to the Navy that sterling had on silver. The highest possible standard. No exceptions. When historians study the Pacific War, they talk about island campaigns, naval battles, and strategic bombing. The Hellcat sits underneath all of it. Invisible, unglamorous, doing the one job that made everything else possible. Clearing the sky. 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every single Hellcat lost in combat. 75% of every aerial victory the United States Navy recorded in the entire war. One factory, one plane. Built by 25,500 people on farmland in Long Island who decided that losing was not an option. That is not a war story. That is an engineering story, and it is the kind of story this channel exists to tell. If you want more of this, the machines, the factories, the mathematics behind how the war was actually won, subscribe to the channel. Every week we go deeper,